Welcome to Powerful Women Rising, the podcast for female entrepreneurs playing by their own rules and growing their businesses their way. Join business relationship strategist and your host, Melissa Snow, as she brings you practical perspectives and candid conversations. Each episode guides you to make smarter decisions and take bold action as you build a business that's both profitable and aligned. Because the world is a better place when powerful women rise together.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Powerful Women Rising podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Snow. I'm a business relationship strategist and the founder of Powerful Women Rising. We do a lot of things over here at Powerful Women Rising, not just this podcast, which we love and is super fun, but we also have the Powerful Women Rising Connection Network, which is a virtual networking community for female entrepreneurs who maybe don't love traditional networking. Maybe you've tried it before and it feels a little salesy, there's too much small talk, you feel kind of awkward, you're not really into the transactional relationships. You really want to create genuine connections with other people who are not only people that you like and would want to hang out with on a Friday night, but they're also people who take business seriously, their business and yours. They say your name in rooms that you're not in. They're looking for opportunities for you to advance, to get more visible, to find new clients, and you're doing the same for them. Inside the Powerful Women Rising Connection Network, so many new connections are being built every day, and we would love to have you as a member. Click the link in the show notes and check it out if you're interested. All right, let's dive into today's episode because this might be one of the most important podcast episodes we've ever had here at Powerful Women Rising. This episode might be the thing that changes your life, changes your business, changes your income, changes your lifestyle forever and ever, and I'm not even exaggerating. This interview with Mike Jesowshek is about taxes, which I know doesn't sound exciting, but it's something that we all have to deal with, especially as business owners. And there are ways that we can deal with our taxes that allow us to still feel like we are in control, that we know what we're doing, we're not just handing it off to someone else, and also feel really confident that things are being done correctly and that we are maximizing the amount of money that is coming to us at the end of the day. You know, if I bring a male guest onto the podcast, it's going to be good. It's only happened a few times in the past, but this is no exception. When I got Mike Jesowshek's application to be on the podcast, I knew I had to have him on as a guest. I've listened to his podcast for several months now, and the way that he talks about taxes is really a way that makes sense, that you can understand, that you don't feel like he is mansplaining to you or talking down to you, and it really, really does help you feel empowered in your business. So I was really excited to sit down with him today and talk to him about all things business taxes. Mike Jesowshek is a CPA and the founder of TaxElm, host of the Small Business Tax Saving Podcast, and the author of the Small Business Tax Savings Handbook. He's helped thousands of entrepreneurs legally reduce their tax bills through clear, actionable strategies, and he's on a mission to make tax saving simple, accessible, and stress-free for everyone. Good morning, Mike. Welcome to the Powerful Women Rising podcast.
Melissa, thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you. It's funny because most of our podcast guests have been females. I've been doing this podcast for years now. I think this is episode 130 something. And I think you're the third or fourth man to have on here. So we're very excited.
I was looking at that when I was signing up, and I did notice some other males on there. So I'm like, okay, I think I could bring some value. So hopefully it's good.
Yeah, no, we're excited to have you. And I'm excited to talk to you about taxes today because this is something that I think most people, especially business owners, don't necessarily find exciting, but it's something that we need to know about and we need to think about. And I think a lot of times we learn these things through trial and error. We get years into our business and someone mentions something to us about tax planning or, something like that. And we're like, what are you talking about? So I think this is a really exciting topic to talk about for people who are brand new to business and don't really know how to even set things up, but also people who have been in business for a while and may be able to do things a little bit differently to increase their bottom line. So before we get started, tell everybody a little bit about you and about what you do.
Yeah. So I've been an entrepreneur since the age of 14, really kind of got started in the online marketing industry. And so was doing all sorts of things within the online marketing industry, but eventually went to school in college for accounting. And really that was just my backup plan. I was still running a company at that time and had a partnership with a lot of people. But graduated, got my CPA, and was running the finance part of our company. And we had a company with 7 partners at that time. And we were all really good at what we did, but it was all very different parts of the industry. And so we were trying to pull this company into a bunch of different directions. And at that point in time said, instead of trying to do all that, why don't we go out and do our own thing? And so that is when we split off. And I started a cloud-based accounting firm back in 2013. And cloud-based accounting is pretty common now, but in 2013, it really wasn't. But the industry I came from was a lot of younger generation. Everyone at that time was already working remotely. And that was the industry that I would start out in. But you kind of mentioned this idea of people not really knowing from a tax standpoint where they kind of fall into it, or they realize that they need to do tax planning when it's too late, or when they've had an experience and like, okay, I don't want to face that bill again. How do I tackle that? That's really how my journey into tax planning went. When I started my accounting firm, I didn't do anything from a tax standpoint. I was strictly accounting, finance, bookkeeping was our focus, but saw such a need for small business owners to understand tax strategies available. And I was facing the same thing. And whenever I would reach out to accountants, I just couldn't get a good referral partner for the tax planning piece. It found great tax preparers out there, but just really kind of struggled to find the piece on the planning side, on the strategy side. And so started to build the tax side of it, and started a podcast about 8 years ago focusing on teaching these tax strategies to small business owners, and just really fell in love with the tax planning piece. Ended up selling the majority stake in my firm back in 2021 to go full-time into podcasting, and then also launched a software 2 years ago as well. So that's kind of a long roundabout way. Is I'm living out my backup plan for the last 13, 14 years now.
That's awesome. I love that. What a cool story. And amazing that you started when you were 14. I don't even know what I was doing at 14, eating dirt probably.
Yeah, no, I actually say, what I was doing was a lot of eBay type stuff. And so my dad started this. He used to go to auctions, buy stuff, resell it, had an antique store, those types of things. And I had no interest in that. Yeah. But when I was like 6, I would go to the auctions with him, and I would go play pool in the back, or, do whatever I want to do while he was at the auction. But he bought at one auction this box of bottle caps, and they were just the caps from, it was a soda or a beer. I can't remember what it was, but they were the caps from that. And he spent like $50 on this box of like 1,500 bottle caps. And he made that my project. He said, okay, we're going to take 50 of these and put them in a plastic baggie, and then we're going to go on eBay and we're going to sell 50, take the 1,500, break them out in 50 and resell them. And I think each bag sold for like 30 or $35. So that was kind of like just my intro into this concept of like, whoa, like we just took $50 and turned it into $1,500. And at such a young age, it was just kind of a cool thing. And so when I got started in the online marketing industry, it was a lot of that type of work in it.
Yeah, that's super cool. Okay, so before we really dive into taxes and the meat of our conversation, I'm going to tell you what I tell my CPA. You have to explain things to me like I'm in kindergarten because, as you probably know, because you've been doing this a long time, and with your podcast too, the people who are listening to your podcast are probably not CPAs. They're normal people like me, and we want to understand in regular people language what you're talking about. So you said a lot when you were talking in your introduction and things that you do about tax planning. So what is the difference between like people who are listening and are like, oh yeah, I have a guy, he does my taxes, right? Or like, oh yeah, I use TurboTax or whatever it is. What's the difference between what you're talking about with tax planning versus I have a guy who does my taxes?
Yeah, and I think that's so important because even with accountants, people have misunderstood like kind of what this idea of tax strategy is or tax planning. And so I break it down to tax planning versus tax prep. And so tax prep is what people typically think about when they think of taxes, when they think of working with an accountant. And that is just preparing and filing a tax return and then sending it off to the government, the IRS, or the state agencies. And so tax prep is just saying, here's all the activity that we had last year. Here's the income I had, maybe some interest, maybe some capital gains I had, whatever it might be. Here's all the income I had, and here's some deductions, and here's the amount that I paid in tax throughout the year. And then we're filing a tax return. We're either getting a refund, which means that we paid the government government too much, or we have an amount due, which means that we didn't quite pay the government enough and we're kind of truing that up. And so tax prep's important. Tax prep's required by law, but all tax prep is it's taking information, telling the government, here's what my life looked like from an income and expense standpoint throughout the year. And that typically happens after the year's over. So we're looking back at it. We file in January, February, March, April for last year's type of activity. When we look at tax planning is saying, what strategies can I implement? What things can I do in my business between January and December, before the year's even over? But what things can I do within my business to help lower my tax liability? So it's working about strategy, not just so much sending information up. And I think that's where there's a lot of confusion, because a lot of people say, oh, I do tax planning. Like my accountant tells me, send in estimated tax payments of this amount. And I said, well, that's planning for taxes owed. I guess it is a planning of some sort, but that's not what we're talking about. When we talk about tax planning, we're saying, hey, how do we legally hire your kids in your business and take expenses, money that you pay your kids anyways or help support them in? How do we make that into a business deduction? Or how do we, you're working in a home office, how do we turn that into a business deduction? Or, how do we set your entity structure up the right way to make sure that you're paying, protected from a liability standpoint, but also paying the least amount of taxes as legally possible? That's the planning piece. And then at the end of the year, that tax prep and filing, that's just taking the information and sending it up to the government. So I don't mean to say that tax prep and filing isn't important. It is. It's required by law. But tax planning comes way before that. And it's thinking through what strategies inside my kind of tool bucket can I implement in my scenario to make sure that when I do prepare that tax return, when I do file that tax return, I know that I've done the best I could to pay the least amount of taxes legally possible, doing it the right way.
Yeah. Is there a point that people need to be more or less concerned about tax planning? Like if I just started a business, or I'm thinking about starting a business, or, sometimes we hear things like, oh, you should be an LLC if you're making less than this much a year, or you should transition to S Corp after you're making six figures, or like, do we need to worry about tax planning if we're only making $25,000 a year? Is there a point that it starts to matter?
Yeah, I mean, immediately. And so when we talk about tax strategy, I have what I call core tax strategies and advanced tax strategies. And to move the focus to core strategies are strategies that are available to everybody. So whether you're making $5 million a year or you're making $5,000 on a side gig, core tax strategies are available to you. And these are those things like home office, hiring your kids, automobile deductions, maximizing deductions, S corporation. Those are all strategies that we start to explore at even that lower level. And I oftentimes tell somebody that because of the advantages, the government incentivizes people to be a business owner. And when we talk about tax strategy, we're just taking advantage of incentives that the government gives us. So let's use home office as an example. If I'm a W-2 worker working for somebody else and I work out of my home, I have my home office, I get no tax deduction for that because I'm a W-2 worker. I'm working for somebody else. But if I'm a business owner, now I get a deduction for that same exact home office, that same exact thing that I'm working on. I get a deduction as a business owner that I don't get as a W-2 earner. And so why is that? And it's really because the government wants people to be business owners. They want people to hire employees. They want to build the economy. They want US-made stuff. They want all of that. And so their way of getting people to become business owners is incentivizing them. And that way of incentivizing is through the tax code and gives us those opportunities. And so when we look at being a business owner, even people that start side gigs can easily be producing income from a cash flow standpoint, but really showing a loss from a tax standpoint because they're opening up opportunities for a lot of expenses that weren't there traditionally. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say a loss, but let's say you have $5,000 in side gig income. You're not paying taxes on $5,000. There has to be some sort of expense associated with that where you're lowering that to some extent. Whether that's close to zero or not is all going to depend on the scenario. But tax planning starts at any level and should start right out the beginning. And I always say, like, as a new business owner, we need to have a solid foundation for our business. So tax planning is going to evolve. You're going to add more and more strategies, more and more things as your business grows. But you need to have that foundation. What are we building off of from the start? And what are we preparing ourselves for just to make sure that we have the most success from a tax standpoint and a business growth standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that I really wanted to ask you was what some of the common mistakes are that you see small business owners making when it comes to taxes. I mean, obviously, I'm thinking, not planning and doing the things like you're talking about, or thinking this is something I need to worry about later on in business. But is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you see frequently?
Yeah, I think, some of the big ones are business owners just assuming that their accountant's going to take care of it for them. Thinking that if they go to their accountant to say, hey, you're going to file my tax return, you're my tax accountant, that they're just automatically going to do tax planning. And that's a misconception, because a lot of people think that. They're like, well, you're my accountant. Shouldn't you be saving this? But they're not necessarily paying them to do that. Like, they're paying them a cost and an amount that covers the tax return. And there can be a lot of confusion there because people expect that to be as part of it. So don't necessarily expect your accountant to be able to do that. But also, if that's something you're interested, ask them, because they might be offer that service. It's going to be an additional cost. There's going to be an additional piece to it, but they might do that. Or there's a case where a lot of tax preparers just are not planners, and that's totally normal. That's totally fine, as long as you have that expectation going into it. And, the second piece, and this is one of the most important parts when we talk about tax planning, is I always talk about, we want to learn tax strategy. So dive into materials, dive into podcasts, dive into books about the tax strategy. But you can't just stop there. You have to then go and implement it, because you can know every tax strategy out there, but if you don't do anything with it, it provides you no tax savings. And then even a more key part of that implementation piece is correct implementation, because that's what guarantees or keeps you bulletproof from an IRS audit. I always tell business owners, I'm not afraid of an audit. If the IRS comes knocking at my door, I'm not afraid of it, because I know that everything I'm doing is above law and I'm doing it the correct way. I'm dotting my I's and crossing my T's on the implementation piece. If they say, hey, I see you're hiring your kids, how does that work? I have timesheets, I have job descriptions, I have pay, what am I determining the reasonable pay is based on the job they're doing, localities. I have all this documented to do that. Now, if I'm on the flip side, and I'm hiring my kids and just writing them a check for $15,000 a year and having no documentation, now I'm afraid of an audit. So it's all about, both people are implementing a strategy. They know a tax strategy, hiring your kids, and they're implementing it. One's doing it the right way, one's not doing it the right way. And that correct implementation is that key part. So it's more than just saying, oh, I heard a 30-second TikTok video, let me write a check to my child in my business. It's much more than that. So, that's the dot your I's, crossing your T's piece that I just highly encourage people. It's not a ton of work. It's nothing crazy. It's not like it's going to take hours and hours of work to do that. But it's what helps you sleep at night. And it's what helps you knowing that if you get that dreaded letter from the IRS, it's like, not a big deal. Here's my information. Here's my documentation. And we move on from that.
Yeah, that's very smart. Yeah, because I think there's a lot of things in business that we think we can DIY, right? Especially in the beginning. And there's a lot of things that we can DIY. And a lot of times the stakes are not that high, right? Like if I do my own website, or I am keeping track of my own calendar, or whatever it is, and I mess something up, okay, fixable, we can do it. But perhaps maybe taxes and finances are something that we want to make sure that we are doing correctly.
Yeah. And one thing that really caught my eye, and the reason I started our podcast 8 years ago, is because I was referring out tax work and expecting with these people I refer to get tax help from them. And let's look at the hiring kids, because it's an easy example to talk through. I would ask some of the accountants that we work with, I'd say, hey, I have a client of ours that wants to hire their kids. Can you give me some insight? What needs to be done? How do we do this the right way? And they'd say, well, it depends. I need to know this and that. And I need all this information to give you any kind of feedback from that. And as soon as clients hear that, they'd say, okay, I'm going the other way. Sounds like way too much work for a little bit of a tax deduction. Mm-hmm. And as I started to get into this tax side, researching it on my own, implementing it myself, I started to realize that, yes, everyone's situation is different and it does depend. But when we look at a tax strategy, it's the same. 90% of that strategy is the same for everybody. So if we look at hiring your kids, how you do it correctly, what the process is, all of that is the same for everybody up to 90%. Now, a plumber is going to hire their kids a little bit differently than, a consultant, or someone with an 8-year-old is going to hire their kids differently than someone with a 15-year-old. And that's that last 10% that you got to tweak for yourself. But that 90% of the strategy is there. And so my goal and everything that we do is to say, how do I help small business owners get 90% of the way there? So instead of going to their accountant and saying, how do I hire my kids? It's, no, I'm going to hire my kids. Here's the kind of jobs I'm going to have them doing. Here's the amount of hours that they're doing per week. I've already researched some pay rates for the type of work they're doing and their experience on what would be good. Can you help me button this up and just and finalize the last piece? That accountant's going to take that and they're probably going to get them to the finish line versus the, hey, how do I hire my kids piece? That's the kind of piece where it's letting business owners know that this stuff's out there. It's relatively easy. You just got to put in a little bit of effort and it could provide some massive, massive tax savings.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've heard you talk about on your podcast before is after-tax versus pre-tax spending. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, so this is a concept that a lot of people, when they hear tax planning, they think estimated taxes, and we've kind of talked about that too. But another concept that I hear so many people say is, oh yeah, my accountant tells me go buy a piece of equipment at the end of the year. Or, you do need a new vehicle? Go buy a new vehicle before 12/31 because you get a big tax deduction for that. And while that's true, like if you need a new piece of equipment, yeah, let's take advantage of it when it makes sense. If you need a new vehicle, let's take and find a way to use that to its most advantage. But when I talk about maximizing deductions, what I typically say, and there's so many, this is a root strategy that has so many branches leading off to it to different strategies. I talk about this concept of how do we take spending that you're already doing, but turn it from after-tax into pre-tax spending. And so I like to give an example when I talk about this is let's say you're a W-2 employee, you're working for somebody else. You get your gross wages and your employer takes all these taxes out and then you get your take-home pay. And any spending that you do, you're sending your kids to soccer camps, basketball camps, you are paying for your home and utilities, your cell phone bill, all of that spending you do is after-tax spending. You're using money, your take-home pay that's already been taxed, and you're doing that spending. Now, as a business owner, and this is part of that incentive that the government gets us, we have revenue or sales in our business, and then we have all these expenses that cut against that revenue or sales and give us to a profit number. And that profit is what we're taxed on. So any spending that we do inside of our business is considered pre-tax spending. And so my goal and strategy is to say, how do we turn after-tax spending, things that typically we're going to have these costs anyways, but how do we turn after-tax spending into pre-tax spending? And in a good example of that is a home office deduction. As a W-2 worker, I get no deduction for a home office. As a business owner, I do. I didn't have any added costs in there as a business owner. My home costs the same. If I'm renting, my rent costs the same. There is no different additional money out of my pocket, but now I'm moving money from an after-tax into a pre-tax. Or if we look at hiring our kids, I'm going to send my kid to a basketball camp or a baseball camp or a volleyball camp or whatever it might be. Typically, I'm going to use after-tax dollars for that. And you go to your camp. Well, what if I could find something that they could do in my business, get a business deduction? They likely pay no income tax on that. And then they go pay for their volleyball camp or they go pay for their basketball camp. And so that's this concept of saying, hey, we're not going and spending more money that we don't need or buying things that we don't need in our business. We're just shifting, finding a business purpose to some of the spending that we're already doing, as long as we're doing it within reasons. You can look at cell phone bills and taking a percentage of your cell phone bill, and all those different things are all kind of playing that concept of maximizing deductions and moving money that we're already spending from after-tax into pre-tax spending.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I know your podcast is a really good resource, and I love how you explain things on your podcast, very similar to what you're doing now in a way that makes sense and makes us feel like, okay, I can maybe try to figure some of this out myself, even if you're like me. And I'm like, anything that involves math or numbers or anything even remotely close to accounting, I'm like, keep it away from me. So your podcast is a very good resource. Are there any other books or resources that you recommend for people who are just starting out thinking about tax planning?
Yeah, the biggest thing, as I say, is just kind of get involved in it. Start to learn, start to hear some of the lingo out there, start to hear some of that. So our podcast is a great point. We also have a book on Amazon called the Small Business Tax Savings Handbook, a really good kind of desktop guide. It was written and built for something that can continue on. So it's not something that has to be renewed every single year. Most of the concepts can be carried on year to year, but I always say that's a good once a year read to just kind of refresh yourself on these opportunities, because a lot of tax saving opportunities, they're around you all year long, every single day. And it's just keeping that mindset tied to it of oh, Here's a planning opportunity. Oh, I need to do this. Here's a planning opportunity. Or, oh, we're going on a family vacation. I also have a conference in that place that we're going on a family vacation. Can I tie that together? Is there a way to do that makes sense or not? But at least we're thinking. We have that mindset that we're changing the way we think a little bit to involve tax planning around our everyday decisions inside of our business. So those are kind of the two areas I'd say are really good starting point. Our podcast, a ton of free content. We do YouTube videos, a blog post for every podcast episode, and then our book on Amazon is also a good opportunity.
Awesome. I will link both of those in the show notes. If people want to connect with you further, if they want to know more about what you do, I'll put the link to your YouTube channel in the show notes as well. But is there any other places that you like to connect with people or a website that they can go to?
Yeah, two main places that they can go to. First one is taxsavingspodcast.com. That's a good resource that has all of our blogs and all those information. And then we also have a software called TaxElm, and that's TaxElm.com. And that's really kind of taking it to that next level of people say, okay, I got the 90% there. I need help with the last 10%, or I want someone to hold my hand through this, or I want someone to kind of explicitly tell me exactly what strategy I should be focusing on. That's where our software can come into play. So those two places are really good starting points.
Awesome. I will link all of that in the show notes so that people can click on that. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing this information with us. It's really, really helpful. It's so funny because I have the best guests on the podcast, and there's always a point in the conversation where I know I've got the right guest because I start thinking, I probably need to hire this guy. Yeah, I probably need to hire this person. So thank you so much. This was really, really helpful.
Yeah, Melissa, thanks for having me.
That's a wrap on this week's episode of Powerful Women Rising. Thanks for hanging out with us. If you're looking for a fun, consistent, low-pressure way to meet other women in business and create more visibility, leads, and momentum, check out the Powerful Women Rising Connection Network. Looking for deeper support, a place to think things through, get honest feedback, and stay focused as you grow? You can learn more about our masterminds through the links in the show notes. If you loved the episode, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. And until next time, keep rising, because building a business your way really is the best way.